welcome to the Classical Liberalism Seminar. This is our first talk of the 2025 academic year. This year we're gonna have 4 to 5 talks in the fall. And before introducing our speaker, let me say why we chose to begin with a talk on Israel. In a time of confusion and political division, I think it's worth stepping back to reflect on our roots. The West has been profoundly shaped by the Jewish people. Our science and art, our legal and moral frameworks, and our theology have all been shaped by the Jewish people and the broader Judeo-Christian inheritance. We shouldn't lose sight of that, and for that reason, we're very honored to have Josh Hammer today to discuss his recent book, Israel and Civilization. Let me introduce briefly Josh. Josh is a Newsweek senior editor at large. He's a syndicated columnist and the author of Israel and Civilization, as I said, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. He also hosts a very popular podcast called The Josh Hammer Show. And he's a frequent commentator on political, legal, and cultural issues. He's also a constitutional attorney by training. He's a fellow with the Edmund Burke Foundation and the Palm Beach Freedom Institute. Josh graduated from Duke University, where he majored in economics, and from the University of Chicago Law School. Welcome, Josh.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really great to be here. I'm not entirely sure exactly what I did to deserve this speaking invitation, but I'm very grateful for it. I'm a lawyer by background, as you heard. So I went to University of Chicago for law school. I did take one business class while I was at Chicago. I took one accounting class at Booth. I did not do particularly well. It was not my was not exactly my area of academic expertise. But anyway, it's really, I'm really gracious for the invitation, and I look forward to our conversation today. So I wrote this book, which was my first book, first, God willing, of any number to come. This was published earlier this year, back in March, and the title that you heard is Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. And I'll talk to you about why I wrote this book, because that kind of answers the question as to where we start when it comes to first principles. It all kind of weaves together. So I wrote this book not necessarily in response to the Hamas pogrom of October 7, 2023. Rather, I wrote this book in response to the response to the pogrom of October 7, 2023. So this was a horrific, barbaric atrocities that were committed in southern Western Israel on October 7th. This was the single deadliest day, as has often been noted, for the Jewish people since the Nazi regime and the Third Reich were in power. Virtually everything, the worst possible details that we don't really need to get into, but any number of individuals, dozens, hundreds of women raped, sexual violence, pillage, Holocaust survivors murdered execution style in their own kitchens, babies put in ovens, butchered, hundreds and hundreds slaughtered at the Nova Music Festival alone, dozens and dozens, well, really hundreds initially, including dozens of U.S. citizens taken hostage in Gaza. And there was about a week or 2 week period after this horrific pogrom where I think the Western world, Western civilization, the United States, our political leaders here in America, Europe, and abroad, the so-called enlightened civilized world, there was a moment of potential clarity. There was a moment there for about a week or 2, 3 weeks, whatever you want to call it, after the pogrom, where they could have said, okay, look, on the one hand, there is this horrific 7th century aspiring Islamist jihadist death cult that just committed these unspeakable atrocities, the equivalent of roughly 45 to 50 9/11s, held population equivalent in Israel, given their size, roughly 45 to 50 9/11s. On the one hand, we have that, the free world could have said. And on the other hand, we have the free and flourishing state of Israel, a first world country, a proficient military, incredible intelligence service, great technology, the home of the Bible, and the world was unable to choose. The world was by and large unable to say, here we have this 7th century Islamist death cult. Here we have the free and flourishing first world state of Israel, the literal home of the Bible, and they were unable to choose. There was that infamous 33, give or take, student group letter coalition at Harvard University, where within hours of the pogrom, I think it was literally the day after, if memory serves, Sunday, October 8th, when the blood was not even dry yet, over 30 student groups at Harvard University say that they hold the Israeli Jews singularly and exclusively culpable for their own murder. The Qatari Foreign Ministry, for what it's worth, put out a very similar statement. And it was just a major 5-alarm siren wake-up call. Like literally before the IDF tanks even started rolling into Gaza, because that actually took a few weeks. If you think back there, Israel took a few weeks to actually lay out the military plan. So even before that, you had on the steps of the Sydney Opera House down in Sydney, Australia, you had some radicals who were chanting to gas the Jews, all sorts of just horrific stuff that burst out into the open even before the first shots were fired from the IDF in response to this pogrom. So to me, that is a massive, massive attempt to try to recover first principles, because we clearly don't understand who we are. We being not just Americans, but again, Westerners, we literally do not understand who we are. If we are unable to look at this dichotomy between Hamas and Israel and to clearly say that we stand with the latter and not with the former. So that's essentially why I wrote the book, was to try to answer these questions as to who are we, what is Western civilization, what exactly are we doing here in the first place, and why exactly is our broader cultural and civilizational inheritance actually worth fighting for in the first instance there. I'm not necessarily trying to introduce new ideas in my book, or frankly in this talk. I'm very much of the opinion, as it says famously in the book of Ecclesiastes, that there is nothing new under the sun. So I'm not necessarily trying to reinvent the wheel or anything there. Rather, I'm trying essentially to just do what little I can to put Humpty Dumpty back together again by trying to bring us back, as the professor said, to first principles and recover a sense of what we once were and what we have lost. So, okay, let's start to get into the details here then. So let's start at the very beginning. What is Western civilization? This is about as logical a starting place as any. So the traditional way that most, I think, Western and many American political theorists, political philosophers would answer this question, certainly the way that Leo Strauss, when he was teaching at the University of Chicago, the way that he famously answered this question, was he said the Western civilization is essentially something of a DNA double-stranded helix, these interwoven elements of reason and revelation. I'm sure most folks here have heard that term, reason and revelation. This is kind of the classical definition of Western civilization, right? Where you have reason that derives from the Greco-Roman tradition there, oftentimes a very heavy emphasis on Aristotle. And then revelation, of course, is revelation, is the Bible, is scripture. Ultimately going back, I argue in the book, going back to the original revelation in the Bible, which is God standing at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus to Moses and the Israelites assembled right there. Now, I don't necessarily object to this reason revelation way of explaining the most foundational question as to what is Western civilization. I do quibble a little bit. My general contention that I make in the earlier chapters of the book is that I think that American society and many other corridors of elite Western society in general have tended to overemphasize reason to the downplaying or at times outright exclusion of revelation. And if I can advance a provocative thesis, it is my contention that unaided reason, without anything else to tether it to, can and indeed has gone off the rails really, really, really quickly. There is virtually no society on Earth that thinks that it is acting in an unreasonable manner. Virtually anyone who does anything that most of us would instinctually, morally characterize as bad, those actors are not doing so because they think it is bad. They are acting because they think it is good. Okay, so the Al-Qaeda jihadists who flew the planes into the Twin Towers 9/11, they were not doing that because they thought they were committing acts of evil. They did so for their own reasons, based on their own interpretation of scripture. They thought they were called to do so for XYZ reasons there. But the point is, they did not subjectively think of themselves as acting unreasonably. They thought they were actually acting reasonably. The Nazis, to use maybe the most powerful example, they're kind of the quintessence of this example, actually. Nazi Germany was the most advanced society by and large in the world. The only country that was really close at the time was the United States itself. Germany at that time, whether it was music, philosophy, art, literature, mathematics, science, so much. It really was the epicenter of the Western world. And when the Nazis started experimenting with eugenics, the very eugenics that ended up culminating in the train tracks to Auschwitz and Birkenau and Treblinka and so forth there, when they started experimenting with eugenics, they thought they were acting reasonably. They actually had a whole doctrine. The word, my German is not very good, but the German word was Lebensraum, which was kind of their way of saying this was their attempt to show compassion for lesser races, for inferior races. Lebensraum, I don't actually know how you pronounce it, but that's Lebensraum. Okay, thank you. So this was the doctrine, and the point for present purpose is that they thought that they were acting reasonably. Now, they obviously were not tethered to an overarching school of thought, to an overarching anchor. They were just kind of acting untethered to anything greater than that there. That's where revelation comes in. That is where this, and it's something of an anachronistic notion, isn't it? You know, in the 21st century, to speak of the importance of literal revelation, I think strikes many of us as something of an outdated throwback to a bygone era. I think there are probably many folks, maybe some of whom are even on this Zoom, who think, you know, what is this guy talking about? I mean, this is made the stuff that made sense a few hundred years ago there, you know, but we've become enlightened, we've liberated ourselves, we've rationalized ourselves. And I'm here to say that no, that's actually part of the problem. That's actually part of the problem in the first place, because it is really only due to the Bible, specifically to the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Judeo-Christian tradition more generally, but really going back to the initial revelation of Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus all the way back then. This is the reason that what we today call Western civilization, the reason that it has flourished as such. And it's worth I think kind of spending some time just kind of going through some of the examples, perhaps especially from an American perspective. That's kind of my academic background. I'm a lawyer. I clerk for a federal appeals judge. I've published constitutional scholarship. So this is kind of my bread and butter here. So let's kind of take what I just said and now apply it to an Anglo-American, really above all, and a specifically American context. You actually can go back, believe it or not, even further than the American founding. We'll get to the American founding in just a second, but you can actually go back even further than that. You can go all the way back to the sailing of the Mayflower, actually, in 1620. The captain of the Mayflower was a man by the name of Sir William Bradford. Sir William Bradford ends up becoming one of the first governors at Plymouth Colony when the Mayflower lands ashore in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, Sir William Bradford himself, this is not super commonly known, actually spoke about 1,000 words of Hebrew. Why did he do that? Because he actually was a student of a well-known English Hebraist back in England. That's another kind of outmoded term, Hebraist. This is a name that was given to an academic, typically a Christian, but I suppose it could be a Jew as well. A Hebraist is someone who was a scholar of the cultural, political, linguistic, scriptural, theological traditions of the Hebrews. So Sir William Bradford was a student of this well-known English Hebraist, Sir Henry Ainsworth. He spoke about 1,000 words of Hebrew. There was actually some chatter on the Mayflower, believe it or not, about actually ditching the English language, having severing a clean break, and then just adopting Hebrew when they landed in the colony. It didn't take off clearly, but there was some chatter about it. And there was chatter about it because it wasn't just Bradford. The Pilgrims in general viewed themselves as the functional analog, the equivalent of modern Israelites sailing across their version of the Red Sea to escape their version of Pharaoh in Egypt, which was the religious persecution back in England. In fact, this is actually a disputed point, but it's a very interesting one nonetheless. So famously, when the Mayflower lands in Plymouth, Massachusetts, the captain of the ship, Sir William Bradford, lands. He gets on his knees and he prostrates himself before the Creator to thank God for the ship landing successfully. It was a very dangerous, unknown voyage, of course, back then. And while it is disputed in the historical scholarship, that there are some folks who look at this and they consider just how intimately familiar Bradford was with Hebraicism, to an extent with Judaism itself. And they actually think that in that moment, Sir William Bradford might have actually been trying to replicate a somewhat arcane, abstruse Jewish prayer known as Birkat HaGomel, which is basically a Thanksgiving blessing that religious Jews like myself say at various times, among those times when you successfully complete an oceanic voyage, actually. So, the next time perhaps that, I guess it's coming up in about 2 months. The next time that we have, Thanksgiving, maybe you're watching the Dallas Cowboys or Detroit Lions, maybe think that, that Thanksgiving meal, believe it or not, actually has something to do with this pretty abstruse Jewish prayer, Birkat HaGomel. So let's fast forward a little bit there. So we're still kind of now leading up to the American founding. There's been a lot. I think a lot of the way that the students are taught about the American founding, certainly the way that I was taught about the American founding, going back all the way to middle school, high school, and so forth, there is you're really taught that the American founding was, above all, I guess kind of to get to the theme of this broader seminar, a lot of folks are taught that America was founded as kind of a classically liberal enterprise, right? And there's oftentimes kind of invocations and citations to Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, who essentially copies and pastes, broadly speaking, a lot of John Locke's writings from his second treatise when it comes to this notion of self-evident truths, that we hold these truths to be self-evident: life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and unalienable rights there. But folks who have actually studied the dissemination and distribution of colonial era literature have noted, and there was a wonderful piece in the Claremont Review of Books a few years ago on this exact point. I'm blanking on the title of the essay. I can pull it afterwards. But there was a great essay that actually looked into this and established that, no, I mean, John Locke was a major figure. He's not the major figure, actually. Of all the broader Enlightenment figures, whether English, French, Scottish, or otherwise, more generally, was actually Montesquieu, who's actually the single most quoted of all of the Enlightenment figures in the colonial era. But actually, the single book that was most frequently invoked by colonial era town halls, legislatures, by pastors in the pulpits and so forth there was the Bible. It was actually really scripture itself there. And there's a lot to be said to this notion there. The American founding was an intellectually heterogeneous combination of strands of thought. You definitely had your Enlightenment liberals who were like true classical liberals and kind of an ultra Enlightenment strand there. Thomas Jefferson would be a good example of that. Thomas Paine would be another good example of that there. But there was, I would argue, probably the more popular, more dominant strand of thought at the time was really kind of more of a biblical, at times kind of Anglophilic, common law centric, common law respecting strand of thought there. That was essentially kind of the Federalist Party in the initial two-party system, the party of George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. And it was this party, above all, or especially I would say the luminaries of this party, that expressed pretty unbridled philo-Semitism at times. So, I mentioned a couple of names there. It's worth actually reading just a couple of these quotes verbatim because they're really just so incredible. So John Adams, who was a luminary of the Federalist Party, was the second president of the United States. He writes in this 1809 letter to Francois Adrien Vanderkamp, quote, "I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of the other sect who believe or pretend to believe that all is ordered by chance, I should believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate to all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization." So John Adams basically saying that the Jewish people are essentially responsible for what we today call Western civilization. Alexander Hamilton had very similar sentiments. Some people actually think that Hamilton was Jewish himself. This is disputed. That's a minority opinion. It's probably not true. What definitely is true is that he actually attended a Jewish day school for part of his youth in the Dutch West Indies there. He learned the Ten Commandments at a very young age and so forth. So Hamilton actually says this. He was writing to a colleague at the time. He said, quote, "The state and progress of the Jews from their earliest history to the present time has been so entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause also is an extraordinary one? In other words, that it is the effect of some great providential plan. The man who will draw this conclusion will look for the solution in the Bible. He who will not draw it ought to give us another fair solution." He's essentially saying that the Jewish people still being alive today are proof of God's existence. This is something also that Benjamin Disraeli famously said when he was Prime Minister of Britain, about 100 years, give or take, later, after Hamilton is writing here, there, and and on and on and on and on and on it goes. At the time of the American founding, Benjamin Franklin famously proposed that the national seal of the United States be Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. Thomas Jefferson, despite his being a somewhat, theologically heterodox Christian, nonetheless was also deeply inspired by the story of the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament. Jefferson also proposed that that same image of Moses parting the Red Sea with the Israelites be the official seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He actually formally proposed that. Think about just the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. The Liberty Bell today, this kind of gets back to our whole reason revelation distinction there. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia today, forever. It's not inscribed with a quote from Aristotle writing in his Nicomachean Ethics. It is not a quote from Cicero presenting a speech on the floor of the Roman Senate. It is inscribed, rather, with a quote from that most quintessential of Old Testament Hebrew Bible books, the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 10, the notion that thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. And the American founding was really deeply inspired by this story. It was a very, very philo-Semitic enterprise there. I've mentioned a couple of presidents already there. How about Thomas? Or excuse me, how about George Washington himself? So some of you have probably heard this already, but it's really remarkable. So in 1790, this is I guess the second year of the Washington presidency. The largest Jewish community in America at that time was in Newport, Rhode Island, actually. I believe that's still the oldest synagogue still in existence in America, is in Newport, Rhode Island today. And Washington writes this incredible, incredible letter, this beautiful letter to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island. They're really establishing that this country was always meant to be a safe haven, not merely a safe haven, but indeed kind of in many ways inspired by the Hebrew Bible and by the Jewish people. And Washington writes, in part, he writes, quote, "The children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." It's a really beautiful letter. I encourage you to read the whole thing. Washington, for what it's worth, was actually personally friendly with a man by the name of Chaim Solomon, who was a Polish-born Jewish merchant, best known as one of the leading financiers of both the Continental Congress during the war, as well as the actual war effort itself. And although it has never been confirmed, there are many historians who speculate that in designing the Great Seal of the United States, not the one that Franklin proposed, not the one of Moses across the Red Sea, but the Great Seal as it exists today, it's on the back of your $1 bill if you have a $1 bill. There are many historians who speculate that when George Washington arranged, you'll see that there are 13 stars in the Great Seal that kind of resemble a Magen David, a Star of David. There are many historians who think that this is George Washington's way of kind of giving a shout out, if you will, to his dear friend Chaim Solomon, to kind of thank him and perhaps by extension the Jewish people themselves for their role in founding this country. So, over and over again, we see this refrain play out there. There's arguably no one who I think understood this more in American history than my single favorite figure in American history, Abraham Lincoln, who was a devout Christian, who he quotes scripture repeatedly all the time in his speeches there. He actually quoted the Hebrew Bible more often even than the New Testament. Maybe what experts in oration rhetoric consider his very finest speech, you might be inclined to think that it's the Gettysburg Address, and that's obviously an amazing speech. I'm not down that for a second. But I think most experts in political rhetoric and oration would probably say that it's actually his second inaugural address, which is probably his true kind of shining example, his all-time greatest public speech. This is a very pithy speech, about 700 words, give or take, that he delivers tragically a month and a half before he was assassinated at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. This is the speech ending with that famous line about with malice for none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. Well, that notion there about binding up the nation's wounds, that's actually a direct quote from Psalms chapter 147, which, by the way, is a psalm that religious Jews say every single morning. I said myself just a few hours ago. So he quoted the Hebrew Bible all throughout his speeches, throughout his entire career. Lincoln famously referred to the American people as being an almost chosen people. Really colorful language. He said this in a speech in Trenton, New Jersey in February 1861, just a couple months prior to the initial shots being fired in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And there's really just there's one more story about Lincoln that I will share here. It's really just another amazing story. So there was an unfortunately anti-Semitic edict that was issued by General Ulysses S. Grant at some point during the war. It was one of the Midwestern territories at the time, or states, I should say. It was Indiana, Illinois. But essentially, Grant kicked the Jewish soldiers out of the Union Army in one of these territories, or states, I should say. And the Jewish soldiers were not happy about this because they wanted to fight for the Union. So they take the train all the way to D.C., and I guess back in the day, it was easier to get a face-to-face meeting with the president. So they find themselves in the White House with a face-to-face meeting with Abraham Lincoln there. And the basic interaction apparently goes as follows between these 10 Jews who had as their spokesman a soldier named Caskell, and then President Lincoln. So Lincoln looks to the Jewish soldiers and he apparently says, "And so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan." And the soldier named Caskell, speaking on behalf of the group, says, "Yes, and that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom seeking protection." And Lincoln says, "And this protection they shall have at once." He immediately overturns, countermands General Grant's edict. Grant, for what it's worth, subsequently apologizes. He does a whole mea culpa, so don't fault him too much. He ultimately atoned for his mistake. By the way, just Lincoln was a very private man. He didn't speak about his private life very often. The only time he is ever publicly recorded as referring to a very close friend of his was actually a Jewish man, a fellow lawyer of his from Springfield, Illinois, named Jonas Phillips, who he referred to as a very close friend there. So, Lincoln himself, intimately familiar with the Hebrew Bible, and certainly a big fan of the Jews. I think more generally here, kind of getting into a little bit of actual kind of day-to-day morality, law, constitutionalism, and so forth there. Let me just kind of highlight some core ways that I think that our day-to-day morality, ethics, our constitutional structure, our politics, our rule of law really is directly downstream of the Hebrew Bible. In the book, Israel and Civilization, I argue that the single foundational ethical underpinning of America and all Western civilization can be found in literally one of the very first verses of the Bible. It's Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. "And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." So in Hebrew, we would say B'Tselem Elohim. In Latin, of course, that's known as Imago Dei, the notion that man was made in the image of God. This is a world-altering claim. It is a world-altering claim that says that man is fundamentally different from the animals of the animal kingdom, that every human being has some spark of the divine in him or her, excuse me. And because of that, is because I would argue it is alone because of Genesis 1:27 that we are able to ultimately arrive at ethical, legal conclusions of equal protection under law, of equal moral worth, of equal human dignity. Put another way, let's think about this. Why was John Locke in the late 1600s able to write his self-evident truths about life, liberty, and property? Why was Thomas Jefferson, about 80 years later, why was he able to write the same thing about self-evident truths, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness? But at the same time, it's probably not the case, that a random, goat herder in the mountains of Nepal or Afghanistan would, at that time period, probably not arrive at the same conclusion there. And the reason for that is because there is a certain overarching civilizational and cultural milieu in which people think and write and pontificate and say things there. And so it is really kind of the overarching civilizational context of Genesis 1:27, of the divine image imperative of that really gives us equal moral worth. In America, that is how you ultimately get the Declaration of Independence. That is how you ultimately get the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. That is how you ultimately get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, due to Martin Luther King and others there. But it really does go back ultimately to Genesis 1:27. It is the single foundational ethical moral imperative of equal protection under law, equal moral worth, equal human dignity. Another very clear kind of ethical example here would be Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, which is the golden rule. So the golden rule, I was taught in kindergarten. I think most people probably taught at a very young age here, do unto others as you would like done to yourself. Well, I didn't realize it when I was a kid. I only kind of intuited this when I was in my young adulthood, but that's actually a biblical principle. This is Leviticus 19:18, which is the injunction to treat the stranger as your own fellow. That's the origin. That is very much the origin of the golden rule itself. And in fact, the golden rule itself is so central, actually, to the Bible. It's so central to certainly the Jewish religion. It's so core to everything there. There's this wonderful story from the Talmud. It's in the tractate on Shabbat, on the Jewish Sabbath, actually, and there's this amazing anecdote between the two rival rabbinical schools. You have Shammai and Hillel, and the story goes that there is a curious Gentile who is interested in potentially converting to Judaism, but only on the condition that one of these esteemed rabbis can stand on one foot and explain the entire Bible to that person, the entire Torah. So Shammai, who was kind of the stricter of the two, something of a curmudgeon perhaps, basically looks at this curious Gentile and says, "Get out of here, you poser. This is kind of a silly question. Get out of here." But Hillel takes up the man's challenge, and he gets on one foot, and he says, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." That is the whole Torah. The rest is the explanation of this. Go and study it. So he's basically saying that Leviticus 19:18, that the golden rule, that this is kind of the foundation of basically all that we believe. That this is kind of the very core of all this there. So I think there are plenty of other ethical principles, of course, that those are two that leap immediately to mind. Another thing that I would argue that is really, really important and is actually a Judaic Hebraic contribution to Western political theory is I think it is the Hebrew Bible that for the first time introduces the concept of this recurring leitmotif that is a tension between individual autonomy and moral worth versus the notion of the whole, the community, the common good. So we spoke about Genesis 1:27, which is the origin of human autonomy, human moral worth there. That's pretty obvious there. On the other hand, I think it is instructive to note that there's a lot of emphasis in the Hebrew Bible on the community, on the common good as well. So, for instance, during the revelation at Mount Sinai, when God is delivering the Torah to Moses, he says in Exodus chapter 19, "I shall make you a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So note the verbiage there: kingdom, nation. There's an emphasis here on collective holiness, not just individual, but on the health of the whole. And there's really kind of powerful teasing out of this effect in the same Talmudic tractate, the one on Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, where it says, quote, "Anyone who had the capability to effectively protest the sinful conduct of the members of his household and did not protest, he himself is apprehended for the sins of the members of his household and punished. If he is in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the people of his town and he fails to do so, he is apprehended for the sins of the people of his town. If he is in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the whole world and he fails to do so, he is apprehended for the sins of the whole world." So essentially, if you can stop the sins of the whole world and you don't act, the sins of the whole world are on you. That is a very different conception of ethical obligation than let's say a John Stuart Mill, kind of a true live and let live. This is very much kind of a more communitarian, common good oriented sense of ethical obligations there. But you have to kind of parallel that and juxtapose it with Genesis 1:27. This is a recurring tension throughout American history, throughout all political Western history, is not this notion of trying to how to reconcile individual autonomy with the common good. We have these debates over and over and over again, and this is very much kind of core. I think this tension is first introduced in the Hebrew Bible. It is very much teased out in halacha, in Jewish law, in the Talmud, and so forth as well. Kind of is getting into just straight up, not so much ethics, but actually just political structure, constitutionalism there. Well, there's a few things that I think are worth highlighting that I can trace pretty much directly from the American Constitution and our political structure all the way back to the Hebrew Bible. I think a lot of people think that American federalism is pretty much just kind of copy and pasted, is more or less is borrowed from Britain, which of course has this notion of devolution of power from Westminster to Scotland, Wales, and more recently Northern Ireland. I think you can arguably find this notion of federalism or really just localism. You can find this really again in the Hebrew Bible. So, for instance, it says in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, it says, "Seek the peace of the city where I have exiled you, and pray for it to the Lord." Okay, so it's not a tremendous logic. Go from Jeremiah's emphasis localism, seek the welfare of your own city. That seems to me to be very similar to federalism. It's certainly kind of the antecedent to the well-known Catholic social thought principle of subsidiarity, which in many kind of another antecedent of federalism there. I would kind of trace a lot of that, frankly, all the way back to Jeremiah. Separation of powers, actually, which again is most closely borrowed, certainly from a time perspective, is most closely borrowed probably from Montesquieu. I think I would be the first to acknowledge that. But you have references to separation of powers, arguably going back all the way again to the Torah, all the way going back to the political theory that's espoused, especially in the book of Deuteronomy. So there's in the Talmudic tractate Pirkei Avot, which is actually the tractate that mostly deals with ethics. In chapter 4, there is a reference here to the three crowns of Torah, where the crowns are between the prophets, the priesthood, and the judges. And this is kind of a very kind of ancient antecedent of how to divide power. Back then, again, it was the prophets, the priests, and the judges. But that, in many ways, I think, is how kind of more biblically oriented 18th century thinkers like Montesquieu kind of saw kind of the ancient roots of some notion of separation of powers. Speaking of the book of Deuteronomy, it's been frequently noted in recent years, especially during the Biden administration's prosecutions of President Trump at both a federal and a state level. There was this very common refrain that no one is above the law. No president is above the law. This was very frequently said, this notion that no one is above the law. I obviously agree with that for what it's worth. I think it's worth thinking for a second about where exactly this notion comes from. Where does this notion come from that the chief executive, or in Britain, the monarch, the King of England, is not above the law? Okay, well, that's actually, believe it or not, right out of the book of Deuteronomy. It's actually Deuteronomy chapter 17. There is a law, there is an injunction that the king of ancient Israel has to write not one, but two Torah scrolls, like personally write them, and then keep them in his home, at his side table or whatnot there, in order to humble himself, because he too is bound by the law. The king of ancient Israel was bound by the law. And in fact, in the Anglo-American legal tradition, there was an old English common lawyer from the late 1300s, early 1400s named John Fortescue. He was really credited as being the first one to actually codify this principle into the English common law, this notion that the King of England is not above the law. And if you go back and actually look at his notes as to what he is citing when he actually states this, he literally directly cites Deuteronomy chapter 17. So, this notion that the president is not by the law, that the king is not by the law, these are, again, Torah, Hebraic contributions, really, to Western political theory. There's a lot to be said in other areas as well there. I haven't even touched, of course, on, current geopolitics or any of that stuff there. But I think I'll probably just stop there and kind of throw it over to you, Professor, and to Q&A, whoever would want to proceed.
Thank you, Josh. Let's open it up for questions. And as the moderator, let me ask the first question. So I'm going to take that privilege. So In 2006, Pope Benedict visited Auschwitz and he gave a speech that I found very moving. So I wanted to quote a part of that speech and then ask you a question. So, quote, the Pope says, to speak in this place of horror, in this place where unprecedented mass crimes were committed against God and man, is almost impossible, and it is particularly difficult and troubling for a Christian, for a Pope from Germany. In a place like this, words fail. In the end, there can only be a dread silence, a silence which is itself a heartfelt cry to God. Why, Lord, did you remain silent? How could you tolerate all this? How many questions arise in this place? Constantly the question comes up, where was God in those days? Why was he silent? How could he permit this endless slaughter, this triumph of evil? And so the question for you is, do you also ask that question yourself, and how do you answer it?
Yeah, this is a great question. So this gets to the notion of theodicy, right? This notion as to if there is a God, why do terrible things happen to good people, to innocent people? There, the traditional Jewish response to this question, which is more or less my response, actually again takes us back to Genesis 1:27. So man is made in God's image, not the other way around. So we have a spark of God. God does not have a spark of us. There are a lot of things that are in Jewish law, in halakha, that strike us as illogical or don't make a lot of sense. What is the actual reason for the laws of kashrut, of kosher? There's famously a law called shatnez, where you shall not mix wool and linen fabrics together. What is the actual reason for this there? And I think that that's actually kind of asking the wrong question, because again, we're made in God's image, so by definition, we only have a spark of His insight, so we're not able to comprehend and intuit all that which He sees there, and that's kind of my answer to the question of theodicy itself. There is that as horrible as obviously the Shoah, the Holocaust, is as horrible as any of the great slaying fields and tragedies of human history are, I firmly am of the belief that there ultimately is a reason for everything. We simply are just unable to actually understand that. The second part of the traditional Jewish answer to this question is that, contrary, a lot of folks kind of say, do Jews believe in heaven? It's kind of an often asked question there. Yes, we actually do believe in the world to come, Olam Haba, as it's referred to in the Hebrew. And the other kind of traditional answer to that question would be that the reward of the righteous, if it does not come in this world, will come in Olam Haba, the world to come as well there. But that's ultimately what I take personal comfort and solace in. It's not easy. I won't pretend like it's easy. I was actually thinking about this a lot last week after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who was a personal friend of mine, actually. I was speaking about this book, Israel and Civilization, with Charlie less than 24 hours before he was assassinated. We were talking about how to handle anti-Israel questions on campus, and we were literally so yes, I was thinking a lot about this last week. Actually, is how can I possibly take comfort in this? And ultimately, it is just kind of with this understanding that there are just certain things that, as smart, capable as human beings may or may not be, that we simply just will not understand, but that there is a higher power that really does kind of understand it. There's also a little bit in the book, this kind of not directly answering question, but I get a little bit into Book of Deuteronomy prophecy in the book there. There's all sorts of language in the final 5 to 10 chapters of the Book of Deuteronomy, which talk about how the Jews will be exiled and how they will be subjected to all sorts of unspeakable atrocities in the diaspora, in exile, in foreign lands there, but how God will never forget His covenant, He will never forget His people, and that they will ultimately find their way back to the land. So, look, there's a debate within religious Judaism, certainly a debate within Christianity as well, as to what to make of the modern state of Israel there. But it seems to me to, frankly, look an awful lot like the Book of Deuteronomy prophecy. I guess I'll put it that way.
Thank you, Josh. Randy, John, and Rick. Randy.
Hi, terrific talk. Within the first 2 seconds, I ordered your book.
Thank you.
And I'm a scientist, and I'm very interested in Western civilization and the inclusion of revelation and reason. And I think science has done a lot to eliminate the revelation part. And I wonder what your views on that are.
Sure. Not to assign you too much reading, there's actually a great companion book to my book that I'm actually reading for myself right now. It's called The Builder's Stone by Melanie Phillips. It came out in January this year. I'm really halfway through it right now. She basically has a whole chapter on this, actually. It's one of the earlier chapters. And, look, I mean, you're the experts in this, not me. But it seems to me if you look at a lot of great scientists over the course of the past 400 or 500 years, I mean, Isaac Newton, I think, is a very prominent example there. But there's a lot of examples. They're attempting to figure out the rules of a rationally ordered universe. Human beings are given insight, are given discernment there. But I think that the entire scientific enterprise is predicated on the notion that there actually are discernible, indeed discoverable rules to all this there, whether it's relativity, whether it's Newtonian physics, anything else there. And I think the entire notion of a rationally ordered universe is kind of necessarily dependent on there being structure and order, which kind of leads to the notion of a king of kings, of a creator of the universe in the first place there. So I think that's how a lot of scientists, since for the past 400 or 500 years, have probably thought about their work, at least classically speaking. I think this notion that science and religion are somehow in tension with one another is a fairly recent phenomenon, honestly, just really over the past few decades. That definitely is not my understanding as to how most scientists going back hundreds of years have understood their profession.
Yeah, I agree. Also, Newton wrote a book on the prophets. He also wrote a book of Daniel and Revelation. And in the Principia, he describes this intelligent God that created such a system.
Exactly.
Yeah, we don't do enough to show that these great scientists actually didn't disregard God.
Exactly right.
Thanks.
John Cochrane.
Hi, thank you. That was I love an erudite scholarly talk. You started with October 7th and the West's shocking abandonment of Israel immediately after and more since. You moved on to the importance of revelation along with reason as we think about these issues. And then you gave us a beautiful historical account of how important the Judeo part was in the evolution of our Judeo-Christian political traditions. What I want to question is the tie between those three things. As you move to Revelation, it occurred to me, well, of course, on the other side, they say, well, God revealed to us too, and God said, go kill the Jews. So we're kind of like on an equivalence there. I think your answer, as I got from your first part, was, well, our system has produced stupendous freedom, prosperity. Your system produces misery. But that is a utilitarian defense of religion, and in a way, an inconsistent one. What you're saying is it's good for the little masses to believe in a God, not necessarily anymore. Ours is the one true God, because they answered that one as well. So that's I think, an unsustainable one. And then I think the answer that are not the extreme left, which has gone completely anti-Semitic, but the gentle center left, the Prime Minister of Spain, for example, who you're encouraging to take on your Judeo-Christian values. Well, first of all, the Christian part of those Judeo-Christian ethics was never very good. It has some apologizing to do for. Spain was where they had an Inquisition. We had a 100-year war where Christians, at least, slaughtered each other over minor questions of doctrine no one can remember today. So that these ethics are great at encouraging peacefulness and understanding your neighbor is empirically challengeable, along with the problem, is it really true, or is it because it's functional, and is it ever so functional? So finally, what they would answer is, oh, we love the Jews. We love historically what Judeo-Christian traditions did for our current enlightened atheist states. How wonderful for you. We just don't like the state of Israel. we love Jews as long as they're victims out somewhere, but we don't like them actually having a state. That's our only contention here, which is difficult to answer from this point of view.
Sure. So let me, a lot in there, obviously. One small quibble, and then I will answer the thrust of the question. So the quibble, I guess, is describing the Prime Minister of Spain as center-left. If I'm not mistaken, he actually just said last week that if he had nuclear weapons, he would use them on Israel to end the war in Gaza. So that strikes me as a pretty radical person, not necessarily someone of kind of the milquetoast center-left establishment, shall we say?
Well, now you know where the milquetoast center-left establishment is these days.
Yeah, right. Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. But okay, the more important part of your question. Look, I'm a religious Jew. Okay, I am personally of the opinion that the revelation at Mount Sinai was real and that it actually happened. I'm of that opinion for various reasons. I think the most obvious of which is that there were an estimated at least 600,000 men standing there. This is the only time that a revelation was claimed to be made in human history with that many people actually there. And I just don't understand, frankly. I don't really understand how, if that was all made up, how we actually have that.
Let me stop you just right there. Our religion is true, your religion is false. It's not going to convince the thousands in the Muslim world, nor is it going to convince the atheist libertarians like me of the justice, which I believe it is. So you have to make an argument of what's necessary.
Yeah, well, I didn't finish my answer.
That's necessary. You're going to be on your own.
Yeah, well, I didn't answer my question, obviously. Or I didn't finish my answer, I should say. So that is the intrinsic part of the answer, is that the revelation of Mount Sinai is qualitatively fundamentally different than, for instance, Muhammad hearing one person in a cave. Okay, that might not persuade a whole lot of people there. It sounds like you're not persuaded there. A lot of people tend to be persuaded by that. But there absolutely is, I think, something to be said to an additional pragmatic or utilitarian argument there. You know, the entire notion of private property rights, where does private property rights come from? I mean, do people think that private property rights actually comes from John Locke's 17th century musing? No, private property rights are literally established in the Bible. It's in the Ten Commandments. I would say. No.
My dog believes in private property rights. Monkeys believe in private property rights. It's an extraordinarily efficient system for inducing proper economic action.
Well, a lot of people don't believe in private property rights. So I'm just explaining to you where the origin of that is. It's literally in the Ten Commandments, which have the injunctions: "Thou shalt not steal" and "Thou shalt not covet." So we can have alternative systems that have arisen throughout history there when it comes to communitarian property, shared property there. But the claim that I'm making from a pragmatic perspective, in addition to the intrinsic point, is that when it comes to basic Western norms, such as private property rights, such as equal protection under law, things that have indeed made the West, I would argue, qualitatively better than competing civilizations there, those literally have their origins in the Hebrew Bible, is the argument that I would actually make there.
But they will say, so what? We can keep those and let the Arabs kill all the Jews.
Okay, so all right, so there's a very obvious follow-up to that as well. Okay, regardless of whether or not one actually believes in Genesis 12 and the notion that you shall bless those, I shall bless those who bless, I shall curse those who curse. Okay, this is kind of an old evangelical Christian sentiment. It's a bit kind of like Mike Huckabee sentiment. Regardless of whether or not you actually believe in that, there, again, as just an empirical historical matter, I cannot think. Maybe there's a historian on this Zoom who can think. I cannot think of a single nation that has ever actually prospered and been better off in history for turning on the Jews. Literally, I cannot think of a single one. Anti-Semitism, going literally all the way back to its first ever instantiation, which is the oppression of the Israelites in Pharaoh's court in Exodus, is here, there, and everywhere asymptomatic of a broader societal and civilizational rot. I literally don't think I could think of a single other example to the contrary. More generally, I've tried to avoid, the capital S state of Israel there, but I'm happy to kind of dive in because you've addressed it there. The argument in my book that I advance, among other things, is that the capital S state of Israel is the Western world's canary in the coal mine against three various threats there: wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism, as I referred to it there. Now, again, folks here might not think that these are all various threats there. I think that they actually all are various threats there. So kind of briefly kind of going turn by turn. So the state of Israel is the canary in the coal mine against wokeism, which I essentially refer to as neo-Marxism, for the same reason that Marx himself actually saw the Jews as the canary in the coal mine. I mean, Karl Marx's actual goal was the overturning of Western Christendom and capitalism, but he saw the Jewish people as a very easy way to get there. He famously wrote his anti-Semitic treatise on the Jewish question a few years prior to the Communist Manifesto, because he understood that if you actually want to go after the Christians over the folks who've actually built Western civilization, then it logically makes sense to start with the original people of the book, the first recipients of God's word, before going on to the great Gentile offshoot, as a 20th century Pope famously referred to Christendom there. Okay, so that's kind of wokeism. Islamism kind of speaks for itself, frankly. I think that Israel is pretty self-explanatorily, if that's even a word, it's pretty self-explanatorily, the footholds of the Western world's battle against Islamism and jihadism there. To give two very obvious examples there, last summer when Israel kind of engaged in kind of a Michael Corleone Godfather-esque revenge spree for a few period of months there, culminating in the assassinations of Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut, of Hezbollah, and then Yahya Sinwar in Gaza. They also took off two other Hezbollah jihadists by the name of Ibrahim Akhil and Fuad Shakur. A lot of people don't really know these names. Ibrahim Akhil was the mastermind of the 1983 Beirut Marine barracks bombing, and Shakur was the mastermind of the 1983 U.S. embassy bombing in Beirut that same year. Those two men had $5 and $7 million U.S. State Department bounties on their heads for 40 plus years. Nothing happened until the IDF took them out. So that's a very kind of direct example as to how Israel's kind of the footholds when it comes to Islamism. And the final thing here is that I think Israel's also kind of the real embodiment and the defender in many ways of the nation state. If you, like me, think that the world is better structured by nation states and not by true globalist utopia, like literally kind of one world government there, if you believe in borders, sovereignty, nation state there, I think that it is incumbent to recognize that one of the many reasons that the United Nations and various other international tribunals come after the state of Israel as much as they do, a lot of it is just bigotry and anti-Semitism, but I think there's actually something more there as well. In many ways, Israel actually represents the model of the nation state, going back again to the Bible. So in the Bible, when King David first unites the tribes of Israel in Jerusalem there, that's actually really the first instance of uniting tribes into a nation. They had no extraterritorial ambitions because the borders were defined literally by God. They weren't seeking to conquer. They were seeking to unify tribes under a common religion, linguistic, cultural framework in a nation there. You can actually contrast that with the imperial model of the world, let's call it globalism, which is kind of embodied around that time roughly as the Roman Empire. So if you believe in nationalism, the nation state, and not globalism or empire, I think there's actually a pretty compelling idiosyncratic reason to care about the state of Israel as well, which paradoxically, on the flip side, is another reason why I think the UN puts it in its crosshairs so much.
So we've come to total agreement. I just wanted to highlight that. You gave three completely unreligious, totally practical, and historically based answers why we should all support Israel. And that's great.
It's all my book.
Rick Schroeder.
Let me start by saying that I grew up in New York City in the early days of television, and I can remember a jingle advertisement on television which went like this. I still remember it. George Washington liked good roast beef. Haim Solomon liked fish. When Uncle Sam served liberty, they both enjoyed the dish. That was actually a public service advertisement in New York City in the early 1950s. Wow. So it was obviously an advertisement for tolerance. I believe Levy's Rye Bread was the sponsor of it. There are lots of other examples. Thomas Jefferson, as you probably know, responded to the second synagogue in the United States as rabbi, which was in Savannah, Georgia, and welcomed them and talked about how divided we stand should be the principle for tolerance and religion in the United States. And we can go on and on. At the same time, Jews were not welcome in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay. And, I suppose my general question is going to be, how welcome have Jews actually been in Western civilization? You're talking about Israel and Western civilization. Well, Herzl's answer to that was not welcome, and that's why we have a state of Israel, because of the perception of not being welcome in Western civilization. Within the Jewish population, you can go back to the 2nd century BC, and Hanukkah, which is bleached, of course, in the way we celebrate it, was actually a Jewish civil war in which Torah-based fundamentalists essentially rebelled against Hellenism and the Greco-Roman tradition that you're talking about and associating with reason. Revelation led to a conception which was Jews should be separate, they should not interact or marry outside, there should be prohibitions on when you can work, there should be taboos on certain food. Let's fast forward to 1900, the Zionists' Second Congress, which took place in essentially the Ottoman Empire in Salonika, and the Jews who were kicked out of Spain in 1492 were living in the Ottoman Empire, where they felt quite welcome. It wasn't a nation state. It was a huge empire that actually accommodated 23 different languages, peoples with very different countries. It was actually a form of political organization that made room for diversity in a remarkable way. And they didn't think there should be an Israel at all. They thought Jews should get out of Europe and come here to the Ottoman Empire. When I was at the Wissenschaft Kolleg in 1999, I was sitting next to a Tunisian scholar at lunch who basically found out I was Jewish, and he said, "Why did Europe get rid of its problem and send them to us?" Another expression of the perception that time and time again, Jews have not been welcome in the Western civilization. And within the Jewish population, even today, there's a big split between whether or not one embraces it or doesn't embrace it. The split between Torah-based thinking and certain Jews who are dedicated to it and Hellenistic, highly secularized thinking is still there. So I'm not quite sure about the claim that we should see this great similarity between Judaism and Western civilization really holds. It seems to me that Jews were actually probably better off in the Islamic centered Ottoman Empire than they might be when they're in Israel today. But I'm wondering what your reaction is to all of those examples.
You're very knowledgeable, so kol kavod. So look, the Maccabee part is actually really interesting. So I don't know if you can see this. This is my personal Siddur here. My name is on the very bottom. It says Yehoshua Binyamin Maccabee in Hebrew. That's my Hebrew name, is Yehoshua Binyamin Maccabee, because Hammer actually was Judah the Maccabee. His nickname was Judah the Hammer. So my Hebrew name is actually Maccabee. And in fact, the second to last chapter, the penultimate chapter of my book, is actually called the Maccabean Imperative. It is an entire exhortation about how to be a modern day Maccabee and not an assimilated Hellenized Jew, but to stand up for the Torah, for Bible, for Judaism, publicly, visibly, in good spirit, etc.
So do you think Maccabees would be welcome in New York City today?
I view Orthodox Judaism as essentially kind of the inheritance of the Maccabean spirit.
I agree, totally agree. And how welcome do you think they are in Western civilization?
Well, it depends. Obviously, I don't think they'll be. I don't think they will be. I don't think they will be particularly welcome in Zohar Mamdani's New York City, which, and I'm probably expecting a pretty
among Jews on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, they castigate what you're describing all the time.
Of course they do.
I mean, the Hasidic tradition is seen as pre-modern and something to be rejected, not something to be embraced.
Yeah, look, the Jewish people have had among them people who reject Judaism going back to the origins of Judaism. This is not exactly anything new.
Okay.
There's of course this notion of the Erev Rav, who are the folks who kind of trailed along behind the Israelites, kind of fleeing Egypt there. But I don't want to get into all that. Here's what I will say, because this is much more relevant and practical, I think, for the other folks. What is more relevant and practical is that there's a lot of truth to what you said, that you absolutely would have preferred to have been a Jew for parts of the history of the Ottoman Empire than under perhaps the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, that's definitely that's almost assuredly true, and I will definitely not pretend like it's not. What is also very, very different is that the Christianity, and this is kind of the whole purpose of part of my talk, was talk about Bradford all the way to Washington and Adams and Lincoln. What's notable is that the Christianity that built, sustained America, and that in many ways has led America to flourish, is in many ways genuinely different than the old continental European Christianity that led to things like the Inquisition, the unceremonious kicking out of the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, things like that. The battle today, and we see this at times. I mean, the past week's actually been very instructive, hasn't it? We see the times when it comes to very fringe, call them far-right voices, people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens. We see a lot of folks now who are trying to mainstream a form of Christian thinking, a pseudo-theology, if you will. It's actually kind of heretical. It's a form of Marcionism, which is really neither here nor there for present purposes. But they're advancing a form of thinking, whether it's heretical or not, that really has no basis, no role for the Hebrew Bible, for the Jewish people, and certainly not for the capital S state of Israel. That is a live fight right now. And part of what I did in writing this book, part of what I'm doing day to day in my life, probably with my next book, is in trying to advance the argument that the Christianity that built America and that will best enable America to thrive and prosper in the 21st century is, frankly, the Christianity of my late friend Charlie Kirk, a Christianity that is really overtly, unapologetically rooted, as was John Adams and Lincoln's Christianity, in the Hebrew Bible, that saw timeless wisdom in everything from Genesis and Exodus to the Psalms and Proverbs, the prophets, and on there. That is really the Christianity that has built America. I don't dispute your notion that is very different than the Christianity of 16th century Italy or France or Germany, whatever. There's no doubt about that, whatsoever there. But America, in many ways, is different. Perhaps we might even call it exceptional in some ways, to kind of use the often invoked phrase. And one of the things I'm doing with this book is to try to kind of remind people as to what made America exceptional in the first place. And that is not necessarily Judaism qua Judaism. Rather, it is an ecumenical biblical inheritance, and above all, a Christianity that really values and appreciates the distinctly Hebraic contributions to the broader tradition.
Can I just make one other quick comment, just by way of a suggestion about the talk? And I'm saying this without it. I don't mean this to have a critical edge. You started by describing the pogrom. I experienced it that way, watching it at a distance. I think many Jews must have, as soon as they saw those films, felt like I'm back in Russia or Poland and in the late 19th century. And that was part of the horror of it. But you then went on to talk about how rational all people are in what they are involved politically in, and you gave some examples. You never went back to the history in the Middle East of the creation of Israel and why that pogrom may have taken place. And it seems to me that to complete the talk, you probably should do what you did for Hitler or for any of these other groups with regard to Hamas and for those who support Hamas, because clearly there's a very complicated story here, as horrifying as it may be. And simply vilifying, which is what you were trying to avoid by saying, look, people who might be have moral sensibilities and be rational can go ahead and do horrible things. You need to do that in this talk. Given where you start, you have to return there, it seems to me, and tell a little bit about the history and why, when Israeli tanks are having young children throwing stones at them, it might evoke the Warsaw Ghetto in the image of even Jews, and they may feel rather troubled by it. Okay.
Noted. Thank you.
Jack.
Well, thank you, and thanks to CLS for having intelligent conservative voices. I want to check you on one thing you said and then ask a question. You said that no country or society has benefited from harsh treatment of Jews. The Roman Empire destroyed the Jews in Palestine and went on to rule in the East for almost 1,500 years. England expelled the Jews in 1290. 500 years later, it had the greatest empire in world history and technologically dominant. Spain maybe didn't do quite as well in the long run, but they expelled the Jews in 1492. 30 years later, they controlled all the silver mines and wealth of the New World and were the dominant power in Europe. So I'm just saying, as a Jew, I would not like to see the future of treatment of Jewish people based on a utilitarian calculus of how countries have done after mistreating the Jews, because a lot of the great empires of history did pretty well for centuries after doing that. Now, I agree that the claim that Jews have to be treated as important is in their contribution to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which I agree has been a lasting and positive legacy for Western civilization. But now let me turn around and ask you what you think the elements of the Judeo-Christian moral tradition that are relevant to you today tell you about the conflict in Palestine as we speak. Because I take that tradition to mean, that thou shalt not murder and that there should be a respect for all human life. Now, parts of the Old Testament treat slavery as unobjectionable. Parts of the Old Testament say in war, you can exterminate your opponents in order to take their territory. So those elements are there. But my question is today, after thousands of years of refinement and experience and further contributions to the Judeo-Christian tradition, what do you think is the morally allowed response to the atrocities of October 7th? Is it an eye for an eye that 1,700 Jews were killed, so Jews can kill 1,700 Palestinians? Or is it 17,000 or 170,000? Or where is the limit? Is it permissible to capture Palestinian children and torture them until the hostages are returned or not? Does that violate certain norms of human dignity? I mean, I'm just curious. Something horrible happened on October 7th. There is a long now moral tradition that you've claimed is critical, I agree, for Western civilization. What does that moral tradition say is now permissible as an Israeli response to the acts of that day?
Okay, sure. A couple of housekeeping notes. The Roman Empire example is actually a lot more complicated than you're making it out to be. The Bar Kokhba revolt and the destruction of the Second Temple is in the year 70 of the Common Era. The Roman Empire reaches its chief territorial height as far as literal square mileage under the imperial reign of Marcus Aurelius about a century later. And that was really kind of the apex. It was kind of all downhill from there. The Eastern Empire is fine, but it's a fundamentally different structure. I kind of object to the historians who kind of say this is kind of a direct continuation there. It's kind of sort of named the same thing there, but it's really in many ways quite something different there. England's a little more complicated as well, but your point is more or less taken. Although even then, after the Edict of Expulsion from England in the late 13th century, it was 100 years after that that John Fortescue again codified this notion that no one's above the law into the common law while citing Deuteronomy. It was in the 1600s that John Selden, who was a literal Talmudic scholar, despite being a religious Christian who never met a Jew in his entire life, when he was sentenced to prison time in the Tower of London, he actually requested to bring one book with him and the Talmud itself there. And he was so there's all sorts of kind of examples that even during the Edict of Expulsion, they were still inspired by Judaic practices. But your point, to an extent, at least in that example, is taken. Okay, so taking us back to Gaza, not using the tangentious and legally and geopolitically incorrect terminology of so-called Palestine, which is not a legal entity, but focusing on the war in Gaza since October 7th, 2023, obviously no one is calling to exterminate innocent life. And in fact, that is actually very much the competing ethical maxims that we see here between Sharia supremacism on the one hand of Hamas and the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview on the other hand there. As John Spencer, the head of urban warfare studies in West Point, has noted based on this guy is literally the world's leading expert on urban warfare. The civilian to combatant death ratio in Gaza for for the past almost 2 years now has been 1 to 1.5, which is the most humane ratio in literally the entire history of urban warfare. Spencer was on the ground in the ISIS counterinsurgency in late 2016, early 2017. He was on the ground in Fallujah. The U.S. Army could do about 1 to 2.5, 1 to 3, give or take. 1 to 1.5 is the most humane ratio in the history of humanity. Why does Israel go so far above and beyond to literally drop leaflets from the sky telling people to evacuate, picking up phones there? Why do they take all of these various measures? Are they actually trying to appease the unappeasable jackals of the United Nations, to kind of use the famous Jeane Kirkpatrick terminology there? No, I don't necessarily think they're trying to appease the unappeasable in the so-called international community. Rather, I think that they are acting ultimately intellectually downstream of things like Genesis 1:27, this notion that no one actually wants to see innocent human lives killed because we all have equal human moral worth under law. On the other hand, because again, what great religion is not full of some notion of contradiction, as has been often noted, what happened on October 7th looks an awful lot like the Amalekites, like Amalek in the Bible, and the atrocities that Amalek committed on the children of Israel shortly after the exodus from Egypt on their way towards the Promised Land. And in the Bible, we are famously told to not forget Amalek because he cut down the weaklings, he slayed those who could not defend themselves there. It looks an awful lot, frankly, like what Hamas does. And the injunction in the Bible is to never forget and ultimately to destroy Amalek. So, when Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government speaks of destroying Hamas as a political and military institution, again, not civilians, it's really sounding quite a bit actually like the injunction to destroy Amalek there. So that's kind of how I see it basically playing out there. It's not, by the way, an eye for an eye is one of the most misunderstood provisions probably in the entire Torah. It's not literally referring to an eye for the eye, as is made very clear in the rabbinic literature in the Talmud. It's actually just referring to an equivalent in monetary compensation as adjudicated by a Beit Din, a Jewish religious court there. So no one's actually literally calling for an actual eye for an eye there. But again, it's ethical war fighting while simultaneously done with the ultimate goal of eradicating the enemy, a la Amalek in the Bible.
Thank you very much, Josh. If I can ask you a final question. So there is a lot of anti-Semitism, obviously, everywhere, and maybe also on campus specifically. But I also see sort of a temptation to crack down on anti-Semitic speech in ways that can be counterproductive. I see that push within this right, maybe from the coming out of the administration, and I wonder what your thoughts are about it. What to do with anti-Semitic speech, particularly on campus, and whether you think this, expansive speech codes to protect the Jews, so to speak, are useful or maybe counterproductive?
It's a very good question. This is actually, I mentioned Charlie Kirk numerous times. It's actually one of the final appearances I had on Charlie's show earlier this year, actually, a few months ago, was we were having this exact conversation. Charlie was of the opinion, for what it's worth, that what you're referring to, at least the perception, I don't know if it's real, honestly, but at least the perception of trying to implement campus speech codes and special rules to protect Jewish students, he had the opinion that it backfired, and that it was actually that it aggravated anti-Semitism. I'm less certain of that. I think the devil is in the details, as it very often is there. You obviously have a First Amendment free speech right in this country. You also have Title VI, which is a well-known part of the Civil Rights Act, which says that the institutions taking federal funds, aka most universities except for like Hillsdale College, cannot engage in various forms of bigotry, racism, discrimination on national identity, ethnicity, and so forth there. And, President Trump in 2019, his first term, signed an executive order that for the first time interpreted Title VI protections on the university campus as applying also to anti-Semitism. And they simultaneously adopted the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which says that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism there. So if you keep on connecting the dots here, then you could conclude that exterminationist rhetoric, I would argue something like "from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free" sounds a lot like that, actually. That if you're going to just actually follow each step of this legal analysis there, that would be the sort of rhetoric that could cause Title VI funding to potentially be in jeopardy there. Now, generally speaking, though, kind of removing us from that very specific example there, putting on my legal hat, I mean, the general line between protected speech and non-protected speech is imminent incitement to violence, right? So that is a well-established legal line going back all the way to the Brandenburg versus Ohio case of 1960s, kind of the peak of the Warren Court. You can't imminently say, there's a Jew, get him. You obviously cannot say that. If you want to say that Israel is committing genocide, which they're obviously not, but if you want to say all sorts of kind of silly, foolish, or dumb things, you obviously are allowed to say them. I think another important distinction here is between speech and action. A lot of kind of the worst instances that we've seen on campuses for the past 2 years really don't actually involve speech, qua speech. They actually involve action. So for instance, at UCLA, which just settled in this big lawsuit there, when they were literally keeping Jewish students from accessing the library or the quad because they're wearing a kippah or a necklace there, that's not speech, okay? That is action that falls well outside the confines of the First Amendment there. So that's a very important distinction to make here as well. The final thing that I think I'll say here, and I guess I'll end with that, there's also a general legal proscription on actively aiding and abetting U.S. recognized foreign terrorist organizations there. Now, does simply flying the flag of Hamas or Hezbollah qualify? Probably not. But maybe there's more there too. So I don't know. I mean, an act like that probably should get a curious prosecutor's attention, if nothing else, trying to see that if there is more there, that would actually possibly amount to a federal charge of aiding and abetting terrorism there. Again, I don't think that simply flying a flag or saying I support Hamas rises to that threshold. But that's another thing that's potentially legally actionable and outside First Amendment activities as well.
Thank you very much, Josh. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully next time we'll have you on campus in person.
Thank you. I really appreciate this. Thank you, guys.